add a section that looks like this. Okay? The name in square brackets is the SIP username. Okay? If you're configuring a SIP phone to talk to Asterisk, when you configure your phone, you're going to use that as both the SIP username, and if it has a separate setting for authentication username, they're both going to be set to whatever you have in square brackets there. Okay? So be smart about the way you name your phones. Okay? The second line there, it says type equals friend. We have different types of devices in Asterisk. We have users, peers, and friends. A friend is a simple shortcut for creating both a user and a peer. And we'll talk about those for now. Later on in the day, depending on how much time we have at the end of the day, we may come back and talk about the difference between users and peers and friends. In general, though, calls come in from users, calls go out to peers, and a friend is somebody that sends calls to us and we send calls to them. Okay? In this case, we want this to be a friend. We want to be able to call this device. We also want this device to be able to call us. That makes sense, right? The next thing we want to talk about is the host. In this situation here, I say host equals dynamic, meaning Asterisk doesn't know where all the phones are. The phones are periodically going to come to Asterisk and send a special message called a register message to say, hey, I'm phone number 1, I'm over here. And the other phone will say, hey, I'm phone number 2, I'm over here. And then Asterisk will remember that and know that's where I need to send calls to that particular device. Okay? We could change that. If we know that that phone was always at a fixed IP address, we could just say host equals and an IP address. But having them dynamic like this with registration allows those phones to move out and be on DHCP and get different IP addresses and still be able to contact Asterisk and say, hey, I'm over here, send my calls over here. Okay? The next line there is the context. The context is what part of the dial plan do we want this call to come into. Okay? Incoming calls can be directed into different places in our dial plan. We can split our dial plan up into different containers or different sections. And so we're saying, have this call come into a section called users. Maybe we want, let's say we have a trunk line out to the telephone company. Maybe calls coming in on that trunk line, we want them to go to a different place in our dial plan, be handled differently. So maybe inside callers are treated differently than outside callers. What a concept. Those sorts of things. So in this case, that users is just a section in our dial plan. We'll see that when we get into extensions.conf here in a minute. That's calls coming into the system from this particular SIP phone.
Oh, okay, so calls from this SIP.
Calls from this SIP phone into Asterisk, yes. Okay. The last line there is the password. In Asterisk, we don't call it a password, we call it a secret. And so we're saying that the secret for this particular phone is don't tell. Okay. So for this phone to be able to talk to Asterisk, it has to have the username of ts_polycom in this case, and password of don't tell. That make sense? All right. So here I've just done a brief text explanation of everything I just went through on the example here. I do this so that if people are looking at this later, they want to go in and look at what were those different pieces and what did each of those lines mean. You can see what those are. I'll leave this up here for just a second so you can read that. Just make sure you understand what each of those 5 or 6 lines in that snippet stand for. Is that big enough? Can you guys read that okay? Is it too small? Sorry for the guys in the middle that you have to kind of stretch your eyeballs in both directions to catch that.
I just want to add with the secret or the SIP authentication password, that's not something the end user is ever going to really use or have to manually enter. So make it a strong password.
Yes. Yeah. For those who may not have heard, Derek says make sure you make that a strong password. Don't set up SIP accounts with a username of test and a password of 123. Please. I think everybody over the past year has started to wake up to the fact that there are people out there on the internet actively exploiting open PBXs and trying random usernames and passwords and trying to break into your system and cost you a bunch of money. Please make those strong passwords. You only have to touch that password once, and that's when you put it in sip.conf here and then when you configure the device. So make it something that's at least 11 or 12 characters long, mixture of letters and numbers and special characters that makes it that much harder for somebody to exploit your system and break in and make calls on your nickel.
What is the use of the password then?
What's that?
If the user doesn't use it, what is the use?
I mean, the device uses it to authenticate to Asterisk. But it's not like the end user's having to type it in on the phone every time they want to make a phone call. It's in the device. It's embedded in the device, in the configuration of the device. Yep. Okay, so that's our initial configuration here. Now, this is a very, very basic configuration. Obviously, there's more things that we can get into. We can do things like access control lists. We can say lists of codecs that they're allowed and not allowed to use. We can get into all sorts of things along those lines. Whether or not we want to be able to re-invite the audio, those sorts of things. But that's the basic, kind of the basic template for configuring a phone so it can talk to Asterisk. Okay, so that's step one. Step two here is to go in and create an extension in our system that rings that particular device. You remember earlier I said extensions and devices aren't the same thing. So now we need an extension in our dial plan to ring that particular device. Okay. So how do we do that? Well, we go into extensions.conf and go to a section called users. So remember, sections are in square brackets. And add a line like the one that's at the bottom of that slide there. And that's saying create an extension. The extension number is 6001. The very first step is to call the dial application and then give some information to the dial application about who it should ring and how it should ring that particular device. In this case, we're saying call a SIP device. The name of that SIP device is XLite, and let that phone ring for 30 seconds before we give up and move on to the next step. Okay? Again, it's a little bit cryptic. I don't expect everybody to understand all the details of it the very first time they see that. But the idea is that we're creating a mapping between an extension number in the dial plan and a physical device. Okay? And again, all the different pieces there, the word extend just says, I want to create an object of type extension. The extension number is 6001. Step number one, we call that a priority in the Asterisk dial plan language. And then the dial application, here's some things that we pass to the dial plan application. Okay? And every application is going to be different on what things you pass to it as parameters. And we'll get into some examples of this. Now again, this is a very simple extension. In a real-world PBX, you're going to have lots of different extensions. They're going to have lots of different priorities. They're going to use variables and macros and functions and do all kinds of neat logical stuff. Crazy, crazy stuff you can do in the dial plan. But I want to start off with the basics here. So we'll start out with a very, very simple one-line extension there in the dial plan. Okay? So when we do this in the Asterisk training classes, if we were going to do this in the lab, I would ask people to go create a SIP account for, say, a Polycom phone and maybe a soft phone, or 2 different line appearances on an IP phone. And then go and create an extension in the dial plan for each of those, and then go configure the phones themselves to go and talk to the system. And so that's why this slide here says, hey, we're going to do a lab. We're not going to do a lab as in you guys pull out your laptops and all do this together with me, but let's go through and actually set this up on this machine here. See if I can do this live here. Okay, give me just a second to get the kind of the logistics set up here. If I can remember the password. There we go. Give me just a second so that you guys, and then I'll have you guys. You like that background? A friend of mine from Romania took that photo and sent it to me. You'd rather be there, yeah. I'd rather be there too. But I love Asterisk. I'm happy to be here. Okay, let's see if I can do this. Zoom in a little bit here. Okay. Can you guys see that okay? Is that big enough text that you can see? Okay, and if that works, then I'm going to make it so that I can type here and see what I'm typing and not have to twist my neck here. So give me a second. Yay, it works. Okay, so the first step, like I said, was we're going to go in and configure some phones. Okay, so I'm going to go to the Etsy Asterisk directory, and I'm going to use my favorite editor, Vim, And I'm going to edit the sip.conf configuration file. Why sip.conf? Because that's the channel driver for SIP devices. So if I go to my sip.conf here, you'll see, I go down to the bottom of the screen here. Here I have phone 1, type equals friend, host is dynamic. Why is that set as dynamic? That means this phone here is going to come along and register to asterisk and say, hey, I'm over here. Send my calls over here. Okay. Context is where in the dial plan is this going to go. In this case, a section called users. And there's my password, mysecret123. Again, choose a better password when you do it yourself. Okay. This is just for illustrative purposes only. Okay. I've also set up another soft phone down here that we'll use a little bit later in the day. I'll set up a soft phone on my laptop here and call back and forth between the different phones.
What would be the other option for having host?
So if I knew the exact IP address where this phone was, I could just say host equals 192.168.101.10, for example. Or I could say host equals myphone.example.com if we had a fully qualified domain name. Does that make sense? In this case, we're going to just say host equals dynamic, and we'll let the phone come tell us where it's at.
Can you add a MAC address?
No, this is on the IP level. This is not at the Ethernet layer. Different network layer. Yeah, it's all based on IP addresses. On your DHCP server, you can say, hey, when you see this MAC address, always give it the same IP address, and then you can hard code the IP addresses in here. Or you can just make them dynamic. It makes it more flexible, that's for sure. All right, so there's sip.conf. Okay, one of the things that you can do after you have done that in sip.conf is we'll go into asterisk here. Here's our asterisk command line interface, and I can type sip show peers, and that's going to tell us what SIP peers we have defined out there. Notice we have one called phone 1, and we have one called soft phone. And phone 1, you see under the host column, you see it's got an IP address. That means that phone is coming registered to asterisk. It's told asterisk, hey, I'm at 192.168.101.10. Okay? You notice soft phone there, it says unspecified. What does that mean? It means the phone hasn't come and registered yet. So asterisk has no idea where that soft phone is because the soft phone hasn't come along and told it. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's the first piece, is getting the SIP device talking to asterisk. Okay? I had already done it in the background. But you would want to do a SIP reload if you'd made any changes, type SIP reload, and then it'll reread your sip.conf configuration file and apply that. Thanks for reminding me on that, though. Okay? The next thing.
But if you started asterisk, you didn't need to do SIP reload.
Right. If it was just brand new. Or if you restarted asterisk, you wouldn't need to do that. But if you've gone and changed the configuration file and you just want to reapply it, and you make changes, you just type SIP reload. Okay? The next thing we want to do is go to our dial plan, right? So I'm going to go into my dial plan here, extensions.conf. And I've made a very, very simplified dial plan here. Here's my users section. Why users? Because in sip.conf we told it the context that we were going to send these calls into was this section called users. And then here I create an extension 6001. The first step is to dial. Now, in this case, I'm saying dial a DOTI channel, to dial the first analog channel on the system. Let it ring for 10 seconds. That make sense? And if I dial 6002, it's going to dial the second analog channel. And if I dial 6003, it's going to dial my SIP phone here.
So when you say DOTI/1, you're saying that it's physically connected to port 1?
It's physically connected to port 1. Yep. Whereas with something that's voice over IP, it's not physically connected to a port, so we identify it by name. So that phone 1 there corresponds to phone 1 in square brackets in sip.conf. Does that make sense?
Can you explain a little bit about the
Oh, okay. So in the general section of the dial plan, there's some different settings. These are the defaults. You don't need to worry about them, but I'll explain them anyway. The static equals yes says that asterisk can't come along and dynamically change its dial plan. Now, if you set static equals no, you can actually, from the asterisk command line interface, change your dial plan and have asterisk remove lines and add lines dynamically. which you may or may not want to do. It's a little more cumbersome. You know, self-modifying code is one of those things you should use in limited circumstances, but you can do that. You can set whether or not the file is write protected.